Welcome to this event. I'm Peter Bergen at New America. Guantanamo at 23. We've done this event for many, many years. We have three of the world's leading experts on Guantanamo to talk about the prison camp and its future. Karen Greenberg, who's the editor of Our Nation at Risk, a book about election security that recently came out. She's the director of the Center on National Security at Fordham Law. She's also a fellow at New America and also at Arizona State. Thomas Wilner, who is of counsel, Sherman and Sterling, who represented some of the defendants at the camp in key Supreme Court cases that gave them more rights than they had when they first arrived at the camp. And Andy Worthington, who along with Tom Wilner is the co-founder of Closed Guantanamo and author of the Guantanamo Files, the stories of the 774 detainees in America's illegal prison, which was really the first effort to actually name many of the prisoners because their names were hitherto a secret. So we're going to start with Andy for some opening remarks, then we'll go to Karen and then to Tom.
Thanks very much, Peter. Hello, everybody out there. So yeah, we're marking the 23rd anniversary of the opening of Guantanamo, which was on Saturday. We're in the dying days of the Biden administration, and we have Donald Trump returning imminently to the White House. I would say that the anniversary is marked by feelings predominantly of relief on the one hand and sadness on the other. Sadness may be a mild word. It could be that that could stretch to feelings of anger and indignation, even though it's very hard to sustain those over so many years of relentless injustice at Guantanamo. The feeling of relief is because until a month ago, there were 30 men still held at Guantanamo, and there are now just 15. So what the Biden administration achieved was to release 15 men. The important thing about these 15 men is that 13 of them were men who had long been approved for release. They had been approved for release unanimously by high-level US government review processes, which were established under President Obama. But they had been held for many years since those decisions were taken. And the reason for that is that the decisions that were taken were purely administrative, meaning that there is no legal weight behind them. There is no way that if these men found, as was the case, that the government was dragging its heels on releasing them, there was nothing they could do about it. They couldn't go before a judge to ask for help in being freed from Guantanamo. They were, if you like, the personal prisoners of the administration, prisoners of the executive, and men fundamentally without rights, which of course reflects back on the situation when the prison first opened, when its intention, being established in Guantanamo, was to be beyond the reach of the US law, where they could be held indefinitely and the United States government can do whatever it wanted with them. Men without any rights whatsoever. And for us to be in this position still after 23 years is truly shameful. And I think that it's a black mark against lawmakers and against most of the mainstream media that they haven't recognized that the United States government is still holding people without any rights whatsoever. So of these 15 men who are still held, 3 of them were also long approved for release by these review processes. They're held administratively. And there is no obligation on the Biden administration to release them before it leaves office. And it may well be the case that they will remain there to be handed over once more to Donald Trump, as happened 8 years ago. One of these men, just briefly, is called Muin Abdel Sattar. He's a Rohingya Muslim, but even his nationality seems to be in question. He's a man who has never engaged with the lawyers who acted on the prisoners' behalf when they were first allowed into the prison in 2004, when the Supreme Court had given the prisoners habeas corpus rights. There is no obligation on the United States government to actually provide legal representation to prisoners. They had to seek it out themselves, and he's never engaged with the process. And he was approved for release 15 years ago. 15 years ago. The other two men were approved for release much more recently, under President Biden, as part of the periodic review board process, the second of the administrative reviews established under Obama. One of these men is a Libyan, one of these men is Somali. And as far as we know, no deals have been put in place for transferring these men for resettlement in a third country, which is what would be required because they are from countries that have been where US law prohibits their return. There are a number of countries that prisoners are not allowed to be returned to. We've also got 3 forever prisoners at Guantanamo. They've been called forever prisoners with some accuracy because they also have never been charged with a crime over decades, but they've also not even nominally been approved for release either. One of these men is Abu Zubaydah, who is one of the prisoners at Guantanamo, one of the few prisoners at Guantanamo who people may know the name of. Abu Zubaydah was the first victim of the CIA's post 9/11 torture program. He's been held indefinitely without charge or trial since arriving at Guantanamo in September 2006. All the US government's claims that he was the number 3 in Al-Qaeda have all fallen away over the years, as we can clearly tell from the fact that he's never been charged. A number of United Nations rapporteurs recently issued an opinion just a few days ago, ordering his release or demanding his release and reparations for the damage that he has suffered. But unfortunately, I have to say that a UN working group, the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, issued an opinion 2 years ago in Abu Zubaydah's case, demanding his release and reparations for the damage caused to him. And that was completely ignored by the Biden administration. So whether there will be any resolution to Abu Zubaydah's case, I don't know. The 2 other forever prisoners, one is a Libyan that nobody has ever heard very much about, who, when his reviews come up, he has his ongoing imprisonment constantly approved. And the other man, Mohammed Rahim, is an Afghan. And there are negotiations underway at the moment for him to possibly be sent back to Afghanistan in a prisoner swap with US prisoners who are held by the Taliban. So that's one story to watch. The other 9 men are caught up in the military commission's trial system to some extent, which is at least a legal process, even though it's one that's fraught with problems because all of the men held were tortured in CIA black sites. And as everybody who knows anything about torture and justice should be able to confirm, the 2 processes are almost entirely mutually exclusive. You cannot properly deliver justice to people who've been tortured. And this is the problem that we've had at Guantanamo for decades with prosecuting men who are allegedly involved in terrorism. Just briefly, one of these men, Abdel Hadi al-Iraqi, has agreed to a plea deal. He is the most disabled prisoner that has ever been, unfortunately, imprisoned at Guantanamo. He has a degenerative spinal disease. The medical facilities at Guantanamo are so inadequate that he's had 7 operations, none of which have managed to resolve his problems. He agreed to a plea deal a couple of years ago and is supposed to be resettled in a third country that will offer him lifelong medical care. That's obviously a bit of an uphill task for any government to arrange. But the US government is legally obliged to release him because he's part of the military commissions, unlike the general population of Guantanamo, the men I've been talking about, who have no rights whatsoever. Recently, the US government decided that they would like to send him back to Iraq, which I certainly don't think was part of the original deal. And it certainly wouldn't be safe for him, and nor would it guarantee that he would receive lifelong medical care. So there is an ongoing legal struggle taking place right now, where his transfer back to Iraq has been blocked and we will see what further negotiations happen. Of the other men, the big story really that's been going on for months now is about the plea deal for 3 of the men accused of connection with the 9/11 attacks, where the convening authority for the military commissions, who has responsibility for the trial system, agreed to a plea deal in summer, which had been negotiated for several years. And what's really crucial about this is that it came about because prosecutors in particular realized that the problems of torture had infected the case to such an extent that plea deals were the only answer, taking the death penalty off the table, allowing some kind of closure really for 9/11 by having these men admit to what they are alleged to have done, and continuing to imprison them at Guantanamo. Unfortunately, when these decisions were announced, Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, then decided that he was going to try and override the decisions that had been taken by the official he had appointed to be in charge of the military commissions. And he has since been rebuffed twice, both by the judge in the military case and by Pentagon Court of Appeals, but is now trying to take this through the federal court system to block these plea deals from taking place, which is a fundamental misunderstanding of what the people on the ground in Guantanamo have worked out, that torture is incompatible with justice. But it seems very much to involve this this feeling that runs throughout the establishment that these men must be punished in a way that people think is appropriate, disregarding the reality of the damage that has been done to any ability to do so, because of the use of torture. Torture just runs through Guantanamo's history like a poison. I will stop there. I hope I've managed to sum up most of the situation of what's happening at Guantanamo with the 15 men still held. There are a few others that I haven't discussed, but I hope that's given a kind of broad context as to the problems that we still face with the existence of Guantanamo, and how fundamentally all of those 15 men are caught in some version or other of shameful lawlessness that really isn't appropriate behavior for the United States.
Thank you, Andy, for that very useful summation. Karen, so just to jump off one question. So, I mean, when Lloyd Austin overturned this plea deal that it was, as Andy said, has been going on for years, he sort of said, well, I'm the convening authority, which is the sort of military terminology for the person in charge of Guantanamo. And as Andy pointed out, courts have not been very sympathetic to this interpretation. But so what is happening now with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed? He was arrested in Pakistan 22 years ago now. He's never even, as far as I know, we're still in pre-trial hearings. There's never been a trial. So bring us up to speed about and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, for those who may not know, was the operational commander of 9/11, and he's freely admitted that he carried out the attacks. There's no denying that he is responsible for this in a meaningful way. And Karen, I think you're on mute.
So thank you for that question, because when you think about Guantanamo, in all of the details that Andy just laid out, the signature case in the military commissions trials, not that, there are many, but the signature case and the reason that Guantanamo was set up and the reason we went to war in Afghanistan, which was the prelude to setting up Guantanamo, were the attacks of 9/11. And so here we have before us the 9/11 trial, which has been in process since 2012 formally, and which is not going to see a trial. To your point, you said there hasn't been a trial, they've been in pretrial hearings. I don't know anybody who said, yes, we're going to get to the state of trial. And there's a lot of reasons for this, the premier reason being torture. The other reason being that the United States under Obama decided not to have this trial in federal court. That's a whole other debate that we can get into at another time. They had a trial case, a trial in the Southern District of New York. And even though the defendant was found guilty, they decided that because he was acquitted on hundreds of charges, it was just too dangerous to bring more cases and to try them for somebody who had been tortured, which this individual had been. And so here we have, it's sort of, I realize now that when I think about the 9/11 trial and what's happening with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed right now, which I'll go into in a minute, I feel like we're all in a kind of charade, that we keep saying, oh yeah, there's going to be a trial. Oh yeah, this will happen, that'll happen. And we look for steps forward and then get upset about steps backwards. But the fact is, there is no way to try these individuals. A plea deal is the only way out. And I think there sort of is agreement on that. It's just that, and I don't know if Andy and Tom will agree with me, for some who are in charge, it's okay not to have a plea deal or a trial. It's okay to just let it play out. Indefinite detention, indefinite pretrial detention, same. And so what happened with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was he arranged a plea deal with the convening authority, who is under the auspices of the Secretary of the Pentagon. He appointed her. Her job is to, Susan Escalier, I think is how you say it. He appointed her, and she made this plea deal. By the way, this discussion of the plea deal with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the other 9/11 defendants, two of whom are also involved in this particular plea deal, this negotiation has been going on for years. It's not that it isn't known about. And a little over 2 years ago, in 2022, when it came to Biden, whether or not these plea deals could go through, this is a good idea, he said, I defer to Lloyd Austin, meaning he's in charge, I'm not, and he sort of didn't want to get involved in any official way or make any statement further than that. And so this is not new. Besides that, these trials haven't worked. We've tried a couple of people. One has been, one of the cases was overturned. The other case, two of the convictions has been thrown out. The appeal is no longer alive. But it's plea deals that people are taking now, and that is the way the military commissions can be resolved. It's not really a question. So what happened was, after she announced the plea deal, which had certain conditions attached to it, among them specifying what had been done that he was guilty of in a formal way, or that they were guilty of, including the other two, there would be a formal plea hearing before the judge, Judge McCall, who, by the way, has delayed his retirement in order to see this trial through to the end. So this would have, been some kind of resolution, as Andy said. And days later, Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense, revoked the plea deal. He didn't exactly tell us what had been the circumstance, and I think many of us, ever hopeful, were thinking maybe he was waiting till after the election, but it turns out that was not the case. And so Judge McCall, who's in charge of the trial, decided to go ahead with it anyway. He said that Lloyd Austin did not have the authority to revoke it, that certain steps had been taken already. The lawyers had argued in furtherance of the plea deal. And once that happened, you can't revoke a plea deal after one side has already engaged in part of the deal itself. And so now, a couple days ago, the Department of Justice weighed in and decided to challenge the plea deal in federal court. And it's before the circuit court now. It will come before a three-judge panel, I think on the 28th of this month, into the next administration. Whatever. I can tell you that we now have a document on our website, at the Center on National Security website, that quantifies, it just went up this morning, delays and how delays have played out over time over the Guantanamo trials, and how the conclusion of the report is there isn't going to be a trial. There are so many ways to delay it based on torture, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to just say one final thing about all this, because Andy mentioned torture, which is what I always say is the reason it can't be tried. Tortured evidence, tortured witnesses, there's no way to do this and call yourself a system of justice that adheres to the principles of law that the United States adheres to, even in the Military Commissions Act. But I think another thing we have to realize is how destructive, and getting to Andy's point about Congress, how destructive the NDAA is in its insistence year after year after year that no none of these prisoners can come to the United States, not for detention, not for trial, not for medical care, not for anything. And that's another factor that we don't always acknowledge in terms of what's an impediment to these trials going forward and to Guantanamo closing.
Thank you, Karen. Tom, and also Tom, can you address the question of what Andy alluded to? There is an Afghan there is a deal on the table for him to be exchanged for 3 Americans who are being held in Afghanistan, two that the Taliban acknowledge they're holding, one that they haven't acknowledged that they're holding. But clearly the Taliban must know there's 6 days on the clock to do this deal, and with the new administration, that deal may be off the table. So can you tell us like how that deal would happen if it happened? I mean, what are the mechanics of that?
Well, and one of the themes I talk about is political influence on this whole and the whole process. But basically, Congress has imposed restrictions on the transfer of any detainees from Guantanamo. As Karen said, they can't be transferred to the United States for any reason. They can't be transferred to countries like Yemen for any reason. And they can be transferred to other countries only pursuant to an agreement that the United States reaches with another country, where the country needs to go through all sorts of assurances for security. And Congress must have 30 days notice before the transfer of these agreements so they can review them. I don't know, there is one exception. If the courts enter an order of habeas corpus saying that there's no lawful authority to detain the person, he should be released, then the administration can transfer them. I don't know how the administration is trying to work this deal with the Taliban, but congressional restrictions would really prevent it. So, I don't know. They may be trying to negotiate a habeas order. We have tried to push for that. For these men, certainly 3 of the men there have been cleared. This fellow has not been cleared for release, but the others, we think they should go in and they should admit to the right to habeas. Let me back up for just a second, because I want to stand back and put these people into 2 categories. I think the great injustice has been to those people who have never been charged. The fact is, 9/11 was a horrible, horrific terrorist attack. Terrorism in international law and US law is a crime. Killing innocent civilians is a crime. The people who are charged with that crime, and they could be, if convicted, rightly held. We made all sorts of mistakes. Certainly the torture did poison many of these things. But as you said, Peter, fact is, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed has voluntarily and without coercion admitted that he was behind these attacks. I still believe, had he been tried in the United States, no doubt he would have been convicted. So when we talk about these people in the military commissions, it's a small group. Now, let me give some statistics. About, Andy, 779 men that were detained at Guantanamo. Of those, only 16 were charged with the crime of terrorism. Those are guys who really should have been charged, and it's fine. And we all say, and if they can be convicted, well to it. They should be punished. We screwed that up because we put them, rather than trying them in the United States with Lindsey Graham's background, we put them in military commissions, and all the lawyers we know were happy as hell about that. Said we can bollocks up these military commissions for years. They have no established procedures. That was a mistake, but I'd like to turn away from them. All the other men were never charged. They were really at most supposed to be foot soldiers in the battles that were going on over 25 years ago. The international law is pretty clear. You can hold people who fight against you in a battle, but you hold them not as punishment. You hold them to keep them out of returning to the battle. Once the battle's over, you've got to release them. The people who were there, all the others who are now getting out, and these other 6 who have never been charged, fall in that category. There is no legal basis to detain these people. I will say also that almost all of them, and I've seen the evidence, say they were really not combatants in a battle that went on, but they never had the right to contest that allegation through a due process hearing. They couldn't even see what the allegations were against them or who said them. But even were they true, now that the battle is over, they should be released. There is no lawful authority for holding them. Why haven't they been released? It's purely politics. What's happened is no one in politics wants to take the hit of saying, I've released a terrorist. So they all back away, including the courts. The courts have been extraordinarily disappointing here, to say the least, except for the Supreme Court, which twice held that these men had the right to a fair hearing and habeas corpus and should be released promptly if they won. So that's the worst thing about all this. Politics has infected everything. Nobody is willing to do anything to solve this. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Well, we have a number of questions that have come in on the Slido app, and anybody listening, if you want to add to those questions, please do. So, question from Anonymous. What are the odds that the next Trump administration could add detainees to Guantanamo?
You know, I think it's possible. God knows anything's possible with these people. But I think it's doubtful. He really didn't add them in his first administration. And I think, if you put more people in there, there's more places, reason to keep it open. I think even Trump might think that the $1 billion cost a year to detain a few people is not worth it. So,
right. And, you make a good point. It didn't happen in the first Trump term. So why would it happen in the second Trump term? Seems unlikely. Particularly.
Can I just interject one thing? I think yes, that's true for the war on terror, but who knows what could happen with detention when we see issues, talking about, so either at Guantanamo or a version of what's been allowed at Guantanamo elsewhere on American soil. So I would separate the answer to that question from the specifics of the war on terror to the general question of, could there be indefinite detention under Trump? And given what we've heard, that is not an impossibility.
Let me just say, though, the whole legal theory of being able to detain people indefinitely without review was because they were foreigners detained outside U.S. sovereign territory.
Right.
So the idea that they could replicate that in the United States is, unless the country has gone totally well. I mean, people, certainly United States citizens in the United States territory and foreigners under Supreme Court law have rights. So
Anonymous is asking, is one solution returning Guantanamo to Cuba?
Well, it is under the sovereignty of Cuba, ultimate sovereignty.
Because we're leasing it.
Hmm?
Because we're leasing it, theoretically?
Yeah, it's a lease. It really goes on in perpetuity unless we say it's on. But it says we have complete control over it, but it's not subject to the ultimate sovereignty of Cuba. That was their argument. It's Cuban sovereignty. So
why is the Biden administration not giving Guantanamo detainees reparations for being held for many years for no reason? And sort of a corollary to that is, I mean, do they get anything? Other than a get out of jail free card, or what is? We just had this group of I think 11 Yemenis go to Oman, which is a country that is allowed to accept them or has agreed to accept them. I mean, what happens, Andy, when they get to Oman? I mean, what's the sort of track record of? There was a narrative in the Bush years that a lot returned to the battlefield, which I think was mostly, I was mostly skeptical about. But how do they put their lives back together, and do they?
Well, to answer just the question that was asked about reparations, I mean, I think that for me, the key element of this is that decisions are always made in the presence of lawyers. And what happened in 2004, when the Bush administration introduced what were called combatant status review tribunals as a kind of snub to the Supreme Court, which had granted the prisoners habeas corpus rights, which Congress then tried to take away for another 4 years. But they set up these military tribunals at Guantanamo, which were intended to rubber stamp the men's prior designation as enemy combatants without rights. And what they did was that, while approving most people for ongoing imprisonment as enemy combatants. They had a little get-out clause where a number of the men were declared to be not enemy combatants. That lasted, I think, in the summer of 2004 for maybe a couple of weeks before the lawyers were consulted and said, don't call them not enemy combatants, because that will make us liable for the fact that we've wrongfully imprisoned them. And it was dutifully changed to no longer enemy combatants. It's the little example that I use to demonstrate that, you know, the lawyers have worked hard to try and make sure that the United States can't be held accountable for the wrongful imprisonment of almost everybody that is held at Guantanamo. And it's going to take a long time to address that, but it does need to be addressed so that there will be issues of accountability and reparation. You know, I suspect, sadly, that this, you know, this could take, you know, decades, but it absolutely definitely needs to be done. In terms of the men resettled in Oman, Peter, I would very much hope that that they helped to rebuild their lives. This was certainly the case with a number of men who were resettled in Oman at the end of the Biden administration. The one note of caution that I have is that these men who were resettled in Oman were sent back to Yemen at the end of last summer, which is wrong on so many levels, because the whole point about them not being sent back to Yemen in the first place was because US law prohibits it. It's regarded as unsafe from a national security point of view. But they were sent back, as were a number of Yemenis earlier who were sent to the United Arab Emirates, where they were treated appallingly. When asked about this, a State Department official said that resettlements from Guantanamo were never supposed to be permanent. That's really, truly shocking, because if you're sending people to a third country for a resettlement and then claim that there's a time limit on it, you're abandoning these people as essentially stateless. It's a responsibility that the United States has for these men that doesn't expire after a couple of years, despite this position that was taken. And I'm thinking really that this is an issue that we need to address as time goes on, because the United States has persistently shirked its responsibilities towards men that it has held at Guantanamo, that it is treated lawlessly, that it is abused. And on this, I'm, you know, very glad to say that Fionnuala, who was the UN rapporteur who spoke with us at our event last year, is very clear about the international responsibilities of the United States for people that have been held at Guantanamo. But, you know, these are all these long issues of accountability that we're going to be working at and looking at for many years. Guantanamo is one of those generational crimes, if you like, that, you know, isn't resolved easily. That's why we're still here after 23 years. But the treatment of former prisoners is hugely important.
Let me just say one thing about your reparations thing, and I agree with everything Andy says, but in the terms of an administration, it's a political balance. Everything you do to really, I mean, there's no doubt that the Biden administration wants to close Guantanamo, as did Obama, but everything you try to do gets a political pushback. And the judgment is reparations will make it more difficult to release people. It'll build up more opposition. So, you know, it's not just legal rights, it's what can you thread through the needle. So,
Tom, quick question. You know, the United States has increasingly defined people held in Russia, China, Iran, elsewhere, typically American rivals, in some cases wrongfully detained. So Brittany Griner was wrongfully detained and she was exchanged for Victor Bout, a notorious arms dealer. But by any reasonable detention, by any reasonable kind of characterization, it seems that most of the people in Guantanamo were wrongfully detained
yes.
By the United States. And yet there seems to be very little self-awareness of these facts.
Yes, the hypocrisy is extraordinary. Last night I was watching on PBS about something about are attempt to get wrongfully detained people back to the United States. Many of these people, like Brittany Griner, actually committed a crime.
Right.
You know, I mean, it's disgraceful, and yet there's no self-awareness in the United States. We are still holier than thou, and we are holding these men and have held them for more than 20 years without any legal basis whatsoever. And our violent court system has looked away. Nobody has stood up for it.
Aaron, question for you. But the politicization around Guantanamo seems to have really subsided. I mean, back when there was a discussion about maybe bringing Khalid Sheikh Mohammed to the United States, I mean, I think Rudy Giuliani was still mayor, I think, in New York. It would have been in the Southern District, and there was a
No, it
huge...
was Mike
It was
Bloomberg.
Bloomberg.
Oh, it was Bloomberg. There was a
Yeah.
huge kerfuffle about, like, it would be
Yeah.
so dangerous to try and in the Southern District, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And people really seem to believe that. But we've had this transfer of 11 Yemenis to Oman. It was like a page 24 story in the New York Times, and no one really seemed to object. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's both good news and bad news, and which is why I think the idea that people are worried now about the political repercussions of it is more of a kind of like, that was true years ago, but is it really true now? Look, the original idea of Guantanamo was to set it up offshore, in this case, close enough to the United States so people could get there back and forth from Washington and elsewhere, so that it would be sort of out of sight and out of mind. And it is out of sight and out of mind. I don't think people really know that much about Guantanamo these days or care that much. Those of us in this room and those of us listening and a few more, it's a small contingent that really cares about that. And the question is, what really would be the backlash to closing Guantanamo or to making a plea deal? It's really hard to understand unless you're talking about politics from years ago. And yes, they could try, but where's the there? And there's so few people left. And as Andy laid it out in the very beginning, we know who they are. We know what the issues are with each one of them, whether it's health, whether it's the country they actually go to, or how the case is going to be resolved. But it's not only not front and center. It's off the grid in terms of the mainstream issues of politics these days.
Well, that's not the way politicians view it in the United States. And you might be right. And the reason they don't, I got to remind you that when Obama wanted to close Guantanamo originally, he had a deal that Greg Craig, his counsel, struck to take a Uyghur. Now, the Uyghurs were known by everyone to be falsely taken to Guantanamo, to go and settle them in Northern Virginia. And Frank Wolf, the congressman there, stood up and yelled, "You're letting terrorists in our territory." The way people, and this, you know, you're talking about a country that's split almost evenly between the parties. If somebody's facing something and he thinks one guy can go in there and he can cast, you know, swing 10,000 votes, 5,000 votes, 2,000 votes, it can do it. So they are chickens and they're afraid, and nobody goes forward and say, this is wrong. America shouldn't do this. You know, we're trying to, so they're not carrying it, but the politics still play. That's the way they view it.
Right. And to your point, it's about leadership. And as with Obama, the trade-offs for other things that were more important for leadership on issues that would, you know, that were crucial, like the Affordable Care Act in that particular instance. But it's just, I agree with everything you said, but wouldn't you like to see the leader could actually say, this is a waste of time, money, effort, and a travesty in terms of human rights, and let's
well, you know, I will say, I mean, I think Obama was a terrible chicken on the whole thing, and he lost it. He lost the control of his presidency by backing up. I think Biden has been better and is working hard, but it's a shame. And as Peter said, it hurts us around the world when we're trying to say we want fairness. We don't want people to. So you're right. I agree.
Yeah.
But we deal in a real world.
this is a question from Mark Fallon, who knows a lot about this subject. And it's a question, basically the question, when the commissions were initially debated, the Pentagon, most of the senior JAGs, i.e. Military lawyers, advocated for the UCMJ, i.e. the Uniform Code of Military Justice, rather than commissions, because that has a manual for courts martial. I'd be interested in your views on if the Uniform Code of Military Justice was used as an alternative, Tom, if you have views.
Well, yeah, you know, as I say, I think they should have been tried in federal courts as criminals. And I think that, torture was a problem, but I think you could have gotten convictions.
Yeah.
Yes, but the real problem, as soon as you went to a military commission system that had no defined background, no precedential base to look to, the government was in problems. And the Uniform Code of Military Justice, I think Gene Fidel said this too. You could have used it, there were standards and procedures that were accepted, would have been much better.
And we tied ourselves in a giant pretzel. I mean, just as a very obvious point to everybody here, and probably to many people listening, but for people who may be less familiar, I mean, they were being held simultaneously, in a sense, as prisoners of war and also criminals. And that's a very novel kind of approach, because prisoners of wars, unless they've committed war crimes, are not subject to criminal law.
And must be released when the battle is over.
Right, and the battle was over in the summer of 2021, at least the one in Afghanistan.
But
Yes.
remember, the people in authority at Guantanamo, Mike Leonard and others, were told explicitly at the beginning of Guantanamo, these are not prisoners of war. Don't you dare use the word prisoners. You will get us in trouble in terms of the Geneva Conventions and international law. That's why they're called detainees. That's why we know them as detainees. So yes, all of this is correct, but the idea of sliding out of the law at the very beginning was baked into the pie and was not recognized as the category that would control in a legal way.
And the courts did not step in and enforce the law and say, look, this is bullshit. Excuse me.
Yes,
this is BS. Let's go through. Are you holding these people?
Yes.
Because you can hold people who fight against you, and you can hold them after the battle's over if you charge them with a crime. Otherwise, they need to be let go.
Yeah.
And the oddest things, these people in the military commissions, they will reach a plea deal and they'll be released, as two were recently. They were charged with being terrorists. The people who are not charged sit there without any hearing and go on forever. How absurd is that? So I'm sorry, I'll shut up.
And of course, there's, Carol Rosenberg of the New York Times is really kind of the last reporter left writing about this in a meaningful way at this point. Is that right, Karen and Andy? You're on mute, Karen.
Carol's been the most intrepid of all reporters, been there from day one, even before day one. John Ryan of Law Dragon also writes about it, but it's been, it's really very much in their hands. And Carol has been the journalist of record on this for all of it, and has coined many of the terms we use, like forever prisoner. I believe that was her contribution among many others. So yeah, very important.
There's a very good book by Kathy Scott Clark about Abu Zubaydah called Forever Prisoner, I think is the name of the title.
And Peter, let me say one thing, and I love Carol and I've known her these years, and I'm the only one who's been involved longer probably, but Carol, and she's terrific, but Carol has sort of missed this distinction between people charged and those not charged. She concentrates on all the problems going on in the military commissions, but those people, the real injustice in Guantanamo, are the people never charged, held forever, really, without any charge, long after the battle they're alleged to have participated is over. I wish she'd get that more.
Well, one of the things she has weighed in on in that respect, and maybe I just absorb it, when she writes about that, I kind of reach for it, but is following some of these individuals who have been released and what's happened to them after they've been released. And I think that's a real issue and a real concern about hers, which is very much about the forever prisoners. And I think her naming them forever prisoners is really about those who haven't been charged.
Well,
so
related to that, we have a question from John Krampner. Can you talk about the injustice of Guantanamo 2.0, men being sent to countries where they have no connection whatsoever?
Go on, Andy.
Go on, Andy.
Just, I mean, this is something that the UN rapporteur, Fionnuala, who was with us last year, as I was saying, has focused on in her, devastatingly critical report about Guantanamo that came out in June 2023, in which she laid down the international obligations of the United States, that it can't wash its hands of people that were held at Guantanamo, that have been abused in so many ways, And yet the United States simply doesn't want to take any responsibility. Just to step back a bit from it, imagine people are released from Guantanamo who can't be sent back to their home countries. So they're sent to third countries for resettlement on the basis of entirely confidential agreements between the United States government and the government of these host countries. We know nothing about what's in these agreements. There is no way of enforcing anything that's in those agreements that we don't know about. What we see time and time again, unfortunately, is that people end up in countries where they fundamentally have no rights. They're not allowed to travel. They're kept under surveillance. They're regarded as openly as terrorists. You know, there have been so many situations where people have been imprisoned. It's the same problem that there is at Guantanamo, where these people were stripped of their fundamental rights as human beings. And as I've said, some of the men still held are still in that position, that when they're freed from Guantanamo, they still remain human beings fundamentally without rights. Their rights are not restored to them when they're freed from Guantanamo. And they are unique amongst the entire population of the earth, of having no fundamental human rights that they can claim as their own and that they can back up in any way. Everything remains classified, subject to these agreements that are demonstrably not really worth very much, as we see from the number of times that they've been broken when people are resettled, are supposed to be treated humanely and end up not being at all.
Yeah, I agree totally with Andy. You know, so I represented 2 of the 11 who were recently transferred to Oman, and everybody expresses great joy about it. But there's an anger and a sadness. These guys should have won their habeas cases. They were entitled to it under the law, and the courts back and and the administration is transferring them, but they're not in their home country. They're still in a netherworld. It's not fair or right. So I agree.
Well, not fair and not right sounds about, it's a pretty good motto for this whole enterprise.
Yes. Can I say one more thing? I keep thinking now that my clients are, finally, and I've had a lot, now they're all out and I don't have them. What does one say about Guantanamo? What does it mean? It seems less important now in the Trump administration, where so many things seem crazy, frankly. But in a way, I was thinking the other day, Guantanamo and the people there are almost like the canary in the cage, to give the first signing of maybe the lessening of the value of our initial ideals. I mean, what we're talking about in Guantanamo when we grew up would just seem impossible. It's like it's as bad as what we've faced in civil rights, and people seem not to care about it. We talk to ourselves, but that's the most worrisome thing, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of gives, you hear the words due process. Really? Is that something that just can be pushed aside? You hear about the rule of law. Really? Is that something that can just be pushed aside because the executive decides it's going to be pushed aside, or some people within the executive or lawyers within the executive say it's okay? So how do we put our children in civics classes in school and teach them these principles when in the back of our minds we know when push comes to shove and we don't want them, they just get pushed aside?
Well, let me ask you a question, Karen. It strikes me, 9/11 was a huge surprise to the Bush administration, despite the fact that they received, very substantial strategic warning from the CIA throughout the spring and summer of 2001. But they made a kind of category error that they just didn't think Bin Laden, Al Qaeda were really a problem. And so when you're very surprised by something, you're likely to overreact, particularly if you have underreacted in the run up to that event. And so do you think Guantanamo can be understood in a sense in this like larger overreaction to 9/11? Not that there were plenty of reactions that were completely reasonable, but Guantanamo wasn't really either effective or just. And as Thomas said, there were alternatives. But is that the context? Because I think you wrote about the first 100 days, Guantanamo. I think it opened, was it January 2002. I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, January 11th, 2002.
Yeah. So is that the context?
Okay, so yes, but the question is, does that context ever end? And so one of the things that, if you were going to say, let's say for future events, how to react or not react, yes, 9/11 happened. Yes, the military order to set up Guantanamo happens in the wake of the authorization for the use of military force, right? All of these things happen because we're going to, demand retribution and make sure the enemy stops and they don't attack us again. We're going to prevent another attack. But from the moment Guantanamo was set up with all these different categories and stepping outside military, domestic, or international law, there was a problem. The question was, couldn't there have been a reset button 18 months later, 2 years later, 5 years later? Yes, we did this. It's understandable. The country was in shock. The country had to defend itself. We were going to do everything we could. But you know what? There were ways in which we undermined who we are as a country that has a constitution, that respects the rule of law, that wants to participate in the world as a country that respects the law and respects human rights. And that reset has never to this day happened. So does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, we've been here before. Obviously, a large number of American Japanese were interned without due process, and they had really nothing to do with anything. And I'm not, I know, Tom, you're not an immigration lawyer, but I could see, my understanding is if you get deported from this country, you have to have a hearing. And we're about to have the Trump administration. They will obviously start with people who've got crimes, but they could extend to other groups of people. Do you have a sense? Well, I mean, the practical impediments to having, real due process hearings for millions of people would seem to be extraordinarily high, and then you would also have to detain a very large number of people. There are 1.2 million people in American prisons right now, and there are anywhere between 15 to 20 million Americans here are undocumented or non-legal migrants. So, I mean, is there something to be said about, because it seems that we've had a mixed record on the question of due process throughout history, not just with Guantanamo.
Yeah. By the way, I think Karen was very articulate about what's at stake. And Peter, I don't know whether you read Robert Kagan's recent book, Rebellion.
I haven't.
Well, it's an interesting book because it does go back and show how we have done this time after time in times of crisis. And it's been really bad, but there have been resets. People have come to what's happening? How does this affect us when we plead for our people who are detained abroad? That happened. By the way, I think the opportunity for such a reset really occurred during the Obama administration when he had a really strong majority and had all the houses of Congress. We had the opportunity then. What's happened politically since then is hard to predict, but it's a divided country. Everybody wrangling for that little bit to win, and there has not been a lot of courage in that. And what's going to happen in the Trump administration? I think a lot of people are going to turn away from our rules and concerns and say, I don't care, it's them, it's not me. Just what happened at the beginning of fascism and other places. It'll make the country stronger. Let's look away for the moment and let a strong man do what he has to cleanse our country. So that worries me. I think there's a great possibility of that. No, I don't think they'll have due process hearings for all these cases, although they're required to. I'm worried.
I would just say that I hope that the exceptionalism that we've identified about Guantanamo, about how so many things were able to happen at Guantanamo and why it still remains so fundamentally lawless, is because it's not located on the US mainland. I would hope that the constitutional protections in the United States survive an onslaught by Donald Trump and the people around him. Otherwise, I think we really are heading into extremely dark times.
Great.
On that hopeful note.
Any closing thoughts from any of you?
Well, you know, one thing Karen said is, which is interesting, is, you know, we teach our kids civics and they go on and well, we don't teach our kids civics anymore. I mean, it's extraordinary to me. Most people in this country, young people, don't even know what the Declaration of Independence says, which really defines some, you know, the fundamental principles of this country. I think we really need to make a big effort to teach people why they should be Americans because of those principles. You know, as I used to say, we're not bound together by a common race or religion, we're an idea. And those ideas are in a few simple documents. You got to read them and understand. And if you don't believe them, you're really not American. This is un-American that's happening.
I would just say in parting that I hope people will remember that as it stands now, with just a few days to go of the Biden presidency, 6 men are still imprisoned at Guantanamo Bay after more than 2 decades without charge or trial. That isn't supposed to happen to any of us. If we're deprived of our liberty, we're supposed to be charged with a crime, or we can be held unmolested under the terms of the Geneva Conventions. We are still holding 6 men at Guantanamo Bay who've never been charged. That is fundamentally the behavior of a dictatorship. It has been for the 23 years that Guantanamo has been open, and it is a profound and alarming shame.
Good for you.
I think my final comment is that I want to thank Tom and Andy for all the work they've done. You know, for those of us who just have to consume as much as we can about Guantanamo and learn about it, we have Carol Rosenberg at the New York Times, but the deep dives that they provide, the guidance they provide, the knowledge they provide, it's just been immensely helpful. So thank you.
Well, thanks to all of you, and thank you to the audience for tuning in.
Bye.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you.